So we're starting a new series this week, which I'm really excited about. I prepared an assignment on Ruth last year, and it's really blessed me, and it really opened my eyes to see all of the beautiful detail that's included in this very small book that I think I had previously breezed over a lot of it. Before I did this assignment, earlier last year, I was working my way through one of those read the Bible in a year plans. Has anyone done one of those recently? Normally you kind of start the year off well and you're in Genesis and you've got, quite a lot of exciting stories and narrative in Genesis, and so you march your way through Genesis and then you get to Exodus, and that's really exciting, and you hear about God making a covenant with his people, and then you continue walking through Exodus and you start to get a little bit frustrated with the Israelites. And then there's all of these chapters and chapters on the building of the tabernacle, and then there's all of these rules and all of these, and it can start to feel a little bit like, I've kind of lost my way a little bit, or I don't understand so much of this. And then you can get to for me, I'll talk personally. I got to the end of Deuteronomy, the first 5 books, and the Israelites were just about to enter the Promised Land, and I felt like I was entering the Promised Land because I had made my way through those first 5 books. And then you get into Joshua and Judges, and they're actually really tricky to read as well, because there's lots of tricky stories and, lots of wonderful stories, don't get me wrong, but then you hit Ruth. In our English translations, Ruth is just after Judges, and it's like a breath of fresh air. But it really is like a breath, because it's only 4 chapters. So you kind of read it, you can read it in about 20 minutes, and then you kind of enter into Samuel, and you're back into, it's starting to get into the courts of kings and all of that political and military narrative of the Bible. But Ruth is one of the most famous women of the Bible, but she wasn't actually an Israelite. She was a Moabite woman. So she was a foreigner. She was an outsider. And she was alone when her husband died, and she and her mother-in-law, they stick together and they support each other. And things start to look really, really promising when Boaz comes onto the scene, and it's like love at first sight, and then happily ever after. And I'm exaggerating, of course, and I've been exaggerating all the way up until now, but sometimes I think when we're marching our way through a Bible plan, it can kind of feel like we read these 4 chapters quickly, and it's a lovely story, and then we move on. And it's been such a blessing for me to take time to really see the detail and the beauty of the detail in this book. So we're going to spend the next 5 weeks on Ruth. It'll be 6 because we'll have Pentecost Sunday in the middle of it. But there'll be 5 weeks that we're talking about Ruth. And I've heard it said that Ruth is an intricately woven, magnificently crafted tale or story. And it's close to the hearts of many Jewish Christians and Jewish and Christian readers. The next section of my notes reminds me a little bit of a silly podcast we were listening to in the car last weekend with the kids. It was a Hamish and Andy podcast, and they were talking about the narrator's voice in movie trailers. And I'm not going to be able to do it because I don't have a low, deep male voice, but I'm going to give it a go, and I'm happy to look silly. In a time of war, deceit, disobedience, and unfaithfulness, Ruth is considered an island of tranquility, where a community of ordinary people extend loving kindness to each other. But Ruth is a book that is full of contrast, and this is going to become more evident as we walk through the story. And I don't want to give too much away because we're going to walk this through. But this 4 chapters, they're very significant. It's a very small story in the scheme of the Bible, but it's a story. In this little story, we can see God's big picture. And I think the significance of Ruth is somewhat, there's various positions in the ordering of Scripture. We've got our Bible, and I suppose I just assumed for a long time that our Bible was just in the same order that the Hebrew Bible was originally in. But in our Bible and in many Hebrew manuscripts, Ruth is placed after Judges because it is written in that time period. But then there are other variations of the Bible that have Ruth grouped with the writings at the end of the Bible. And Ruth is one of the 5 festival scrolls that gets read at the different festivals throughout the Jewish calendar. And sometimes it's listed as the first scroll, and sometimes it's listed as the second scroll and relating to Pentecost. And we'll get to hear a little bit more about that, I think, when Helen preaches on Pentecost Sunday. And then sometimes it's placed right after Proverbs. And if you remember the last chapter in Proverbs is talking about the loyal woman or the loyal wife. And it's like it's an answer to that question, an excellent wife, who can find? And it's such a blessing because that chapter can be the Proverbs chapter can be quite challenging as a woman sometimes, because you kind of read it and you think, oh, that's what we're supposed to be. But, we've talked about this before, but when you look at the life of Ruth, and as we look at the life of Ruth, we can see that Ruth is a woman who is following after God's heart, and just in her day-to-day life is just living to honour him. So before we go any further, and I often do this, but I think it's a good place to start when we're looking at a book over a couple of weeks. I'm going to play the Bible Project video because it does a really good job of just giving us an overview on the whole of the book, and I think that'll be helpful.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are 3 main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the 2 of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
I hope you found that helpful. I always find the videos helpful in putting everything into context. There is just so much detail. There's 85 verses, I think, in this book. I think 55 of them are dialogue between the characters. And there's just so much detail, and it all means something. The names of the characters are significant. All the little details are significant. And I think it's great, we've got 4 chapters. It's such a good opportunity for us to delve into a story in the Old Testament and see the details and ask God, why are those details there? Because they're all significant, and the more that I've read it, the more excited I get by how much God has kind of worked into this, into these 4 chapters. So I'd encourage you, as I said, it takes about 20 to 25 minutes to read it. Maybe each week as we go through the series, read through the book, maybe pick a different translation, or maybe listen to it. I've got audio on my YouVersion Bible app. Some of the translations have audio, so maybe on one of the car trips, listen to it. Maybe a different translation each week. And let's just spend some time meditating on these scriptures and see where God takes us. Because I think that just as these characters all had different things playing out in their lives, and we all have different things playing out in our lives. So I'm actually really, really excited to see what God's going to do and see what he's going to reveal. And it's not going to be the same for me as it is for you. It's good. So in terms of how the series is going to flow, today I'm going to do some background setting, and because we have the benefit of hindsight. We know what happens when Jesus comes, but the people that this book was written for initially, they didn't know what the future held. So I think it'll be interesting to just think through some of the things that would come to mind when they were first hearing the story. And then each week after that, we're going to look at one chapter. I'll look at the first few verses of chapter 1, and then we'll continue to do a chapter a week. And we'll also do a short profile of a different character each week, so that we get to just see their story and a little bit more sort of information that pertains to that particular character. And we're going to be asking, as we read the text, we'll be thinking, what did this mean to the original hearers? What was the story? Why did God put it in the Bible? And then what does it mean for us today? So let's read the text that we've got for today. Nope. Here, I've gone too far now. Nope. Okie doke. Ruth 1:1-6. I have gone too far. There we go. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab to live there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. So these introductory verses might seem like simple scene setting and background information, but in the minds of the original listeners to the story, the detail would actually be evoking lots and lots of meaning. We've talked about that before. Like, Scripture's often written in such a way that you hear a reference and all of this other Scripture comes to mind, and this is what's happening here as well. So in the days when the judges ruled, Ruth was most likely written down during the time of David, which was, maybe a century later. But the events occurred earlier in the time of Judges, and it was while Israel was without a king. Now, Judges spans about 300 years, and it's typically chaotic and violent, and it's described as a downward cycle of covenant unfaithfulness. It's quite a difficult book to read, and it's well described in Judges 2, 11-14. Dan, could you help me? Thank you. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. I'll just say quickly that, so Judges, they are established now in the Promised Land. But God had said, go and take the Promised Land. So they're in there, but they hadn't actually gone and taken the land. So there's quite a mix of people groups. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. So essentially, God would lift his hand and the Israelites would feel the consequences of their actions. And then the text goes on to say that they would then cry out to God and he would raise up a judge, which just means someone who could exercise authority, and they would deliver them. So you've got the judges like Deborah and Gideon and Samson. But then the same thing would happen over and over again. God would save them, and then they would forget about God. Over 300 years, they would forget about God. They would start worshipping the other gods, and then they would get into trouble, and then they would call out to God, and it would go over and over again. So it's a pretty nasty period of history. The book of Judges ends with a verse. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. Or other translations would say, did what was good in their eyes. And every time that line is in the Bible, it kind of makes you think back to the original creation story where Adam and Eve did what they thought was good in their own eyes, rather than following after God. But in the midst of this period that's really murky and really messy, and nestled in an out-of-the-way place, a little backstreet place, there's a little community who's willing to walk out their ordinary lives and they're willing to follow after God. It's a contrast. We've got the messy, broken world versus what can happen when we submit to God in the day-to-day moments of our ordinary lives. So again, in our English translations, it's set in this period of Judges. It's between Judges and the era of Kings. And so a lot of the settings in the Old Testament are this either political or priestly or military settings. I can't think of very many settings in the Bible that are in a rural context, told from a woman's perspective. We see time and time again in the Bible that God, he chooses a shepherd boy, or he chooses the second-born son instead of the first-born son, or he does choose to use a woman. But this entire story, in terms of the narrative, is just completely different. I suppose until you get to the New Testament in the same place, Bethlehem, and then we're in a manger. There's a boy king that's born. And this contrast is something that we're invited into also. We're invited in our day-to-day, in our ordinary lives. Sometimes we might get a bit overwhelmed when we hear about the apostles and think, oh gosh, they're such, but they're ordinary people too. Just people who are willing to, in their day-to-day lives, follow after God. So the purpose of Ruth is to show that when people are faithful, God responds, in contrast to what's happening in Judges. In Judges, the Israelites are suffering at the hand of the Gentiles, but in Ruth, Israel is blessed because of the actions of a Gentile. And God responds favourably to her faithfulness, and she's actually not even under the covenant because she's not an Israelite. So it's quite remarkable. So we'll keep going, just staying on this slide though. We're going to talk about Moab and the Moabites. So there was a famine in the land, which is generally code for Israel's feeling the pain of their unfaithfulness. When famine and destruction are mentioned in that context, it's because God's lifted his hand and they're kind of suffering because of their actions. If it was a movie and there was a soundtrack in the background, it might be Chris Isaak's Baby Did a Bad, Bad Thing. But I probably shouldn't say that because I can't actually remember all of the lyrics, so I could be... So there's a famine in the land, and we have a family from Bethlehem, which is here, and Bethlehem's in Judah, and they have decided that because it's so bad in the Promised Land, under God's covenant, they are going to take themselves out of the Promised Land. And can we just go one more on the slide? Because we're in the Promised Land. Everybody was given an allotment of land. You've got the tribe of Judah and Reuben and Manasseh and Asher. Asher was keen to see where he was, and everybody was given an allotment of land, and then the idea was that land would then pass down as an inheritance and stay within the family. Thanks, Dan. Could you click it one more time? Thank you. So they had left God's promises and they had moved all the way down to Moab. And I don't know that we can fully, well, maybe I'll just talk for myself. I can't fully appreciate the animosity that existed between these two nations. I can think about what it might have felt like to be in Europe after the World Wars, or I can try and imagine what it might be like for Catholics and Protestants to be living together in Northern Ireland, or even maybe what it might have felt like to be various people groups living in America after 9/11. But for me, living here in Australia, I can't fully appreciate the animosity that existed between the two nations. So when we read this, there was a famine in the land, they're going, oh, okay, Israel's done a bad thing. So a man from Bethlehem left the promised land with his wife to go and live in Moab, and you're like, oh my goodness, what is going on? The origins of Moab go all the way back to Lot, who's Abraham's nephew, and his daughters, and they were living in Sodom, and Sodom got destroyed, and the daughters' fiancés didn't come with them. So the daughters took it upon themselves to do what was best in their own minds to continue their family line with their father. So when the Israelites see a Moabite, they think incest, they think immorality, they think corruption. They don't see a person, they feel these things. Actually, the talking donkey story that's later on, that's also linked to Moab, because the Moabite king went off and hired Balaam to curse the Jews as they were getting closer to the promised land. It's a good story, I think. If you want to read it, it's in Numbers 22. God didn't let that happen, and instead he caused Balaam to bless the Israelites. And then there are other stories in Numbers about Israelites being seduced by Moabite women, but all of the references are not favourable. So this brings up the next issue. Not only had the family walked away from the promised land, but the sons had married Moabite women. And that's on the next slide. So God felt pretty strongly about this situation. He even included in biblical text, in other laws and rules, that actually the next slide has two of them. In Exodus 34, you must not make a treaty of any kind with the people living in the land. And I haven't put it in the slide. They lust after their gods, offering sacrifices to them, and they'll invite you to join them in their sacrificial meals, and you will go with them. Then you will accept their daughters who sacrifice to other gods as wives for your sons, and they will seduce your sons to commit adultery against me by worshipping other gods. And then again in Deuteronomy, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants for 10 generations may be admitted into the assembly of the law. And then it's referencing that same story that I just mentioned. So for an Israelite people, and if we think back to the people who are listening to this story, all of these laws and rules and yuckiness is coming to mind. So they're thinking, no, this isn't going anywhere good. They've left the promised land and they've married foreign women. But Ruth is a story about God restoring a promised land inheritance issue, because they left the promised land and then the father and the sons died without any heir, without any male heir to continue the family line. So that allotment of land was lost. But God brought restoration to this family through the marriage to a Moabite woman. And of course we know that Ruth turned away from her gods and turned towards Israelites' God. She turned her heart towards God both figuratively and physically, or both in her heart and in her actions. So are you, I hope I'm sort of communicating the complexity and the intricacy that's built in. You know, even the fact that this story is about women would trigger feelings in the hearer, in the listener. We already know from previous messages this year the standing of women in the Israelite community. This is a story of two women, and if you think about other stories in the biblical narrative of two women, it's generally tension and strife between them, if you think about Sarah and Hagar and Rachel and Leah. So all of this is providing thought-provoking background to the story as it's unfolding. And also, as you read the story, it's quite amazing how this community embraces Ruth, the Moabite, into their community. So over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to progress further into the story, I'm sure we'll hear more background information about the gleaning laws and the treatment of widows and foreigners and what the whole thing about being a kinsman redeemer is. But this is some of the background that's pertaining to the verses that I've read this morning. So I wanted to just introduce a few of the key themes that we're going to see unfold in Ruth as we continue to go forward. I don't want to steal anybody's thunder, and I'm not going to be able to do any of these themes any justice. So, because it really comes out as you hear it in the context of the story. Thanks, Dan. It has quite a rich theological message. So it moves, as I've said, the narrative moves out of the battlefield and into the harvest field. We're talking about ordinary people, much like us, and we're seeing how they're faithful and they reveal a great alternative way of living than what was commonly lived in that time. And we're talking about them living the life of compassionate loyalty. So the testimony of the book of Ruth and the Bible as a whole is that God is the master of impossible situations. But there's no massive miracles in this book either. There's no parting of the waters. There's no hitting a rock and water coming out. There's no big strong man like Samson. God's direct involvement is only actually seen twice. It's seen, as we saw in the Bible Project video, it's seen at the start of the story when God brought healing to the land, and it's seen at the end of the story when Ruth, who previously was barren, was able to conceive a child. I've got a word there, hesed. I think it's actually hesed. It's one of those words where you kind of have to have a bit of a spit kind of happening at the start of it. Hesed is a word that's quite close to the heart of the Old Testament. God calls calls us to live as a reflection of his loving kindness. And I can't do this one justice. This one will get discussed more in a future message, but it's showing us that God is, he's active in working through the undertakings of his people. And he's going to work out his purposes through them, and he blesses their faithfulness. So Ruth also considers suffering and expresses suffering in a way that, much like some of the lamenting psalms, permits the reader to express their pain. But it encourages, it lifts our heads and encourages us to have faith in the goodness of God. God's faithfulness to Naomi and her family brought hope to readers back then, just as it does to us today. And we'll see God working through his people, and sometimes despite his people, working through those who have a heart to turn towards him. Thanks, Dan. We see in Ruth that there are limitations to the law in the Bible. Those verses that I read out earlier from Exodus and Deuteronomy. This book kind of raises a situation where I can't say the law does not apply, because there are other elements of the law that we'll see do apply, but like strict adherence to the law about marriage of foreigners in this instance isn't sort of demonstrating a heart after God. And Jesus in the New Testament was quite critical on those who were more concerned about keeping the law than about caring for the needs of others. So this is an Old Testament example of the way that God was trying to get his people to have a heart like his, not so much follow all of the rules, but be a type of people that follow after him. So as I've mentioned, we get to see the role of women, and we get to see how God treats women and the marginalised and includes them in the biblical story. And then we're going to see how Ruth demonstrates what it's like to be living in a peaceable community This community is one that welcomes refugees, it welcomes the elderly, and it welcomes young people in a way that's not characteristic of the biblical narrative. And it's a community that doesn't just say, oh, you can be here and exist with us. It's a community that says, we want to unite with you. You're going to marry one of our own, and we're going to celebrate that. So it provides examples of how we should be responding to others in our community. And Ruth is definitely a story of the heart, because I mentioned earlier that Ruth sometimes follows Proverbs. But last year we talked about the church being the bride, and it's ultimately as a community comes together, as a body, and we unite with Christ. The church is that answer, or the body of Christ is that answer to the Proverbs 31 question, the most excellent bride, or a loyal and faithful follower of Jesus. I was thinking last night about what's the practical thing that God might want to be stirring up in our hearts this morning, and because if you read the textbooks, it'll talk about the purpose of Ruth, showing how God responds to the faithfulness of his people. And then as we respond faithfully, God responds. And that does play out in Ruth. But can you just go to the next slide? The thing that came to mind last night was that before Naomi turned to go back to the Promised Land, God had already started. He didn't wait for Naomi to make that choice. He had already started. He had already started healing the land. Naomi heard about God's faithfulness and saw the hope and started to turn back to the heart of the Father. So I think that one of the things that what God might be wanting to stir in up or remind us of this morning is just this, just reminding us of the Father's heart. Again, this is an Old Testament story, and we have the benefit of seeing Jesus. Jesus came and he said, I'm going to show you the Father. But long before that, God was desiring a personal, he was wanting to be personally involved in the lives of his people, just as he wants to be personally involved in our lives today. And he responds to the faithfulness of us, but he draws us to himself, and he is going before us, and he is recklessly loving us. He was recklessly loving the Israelites in that period of Judges, like when time and time again they just kind of spiral downwards, and then would call out to God and he would respond again. He forgives us freely before we've properly repented. And he cleanses us completely before we've even fully had a bath. And that's what I think he's wanting to remind us of this morning. And as we walk out our day-to-day lives, again in this book we see two women who are in situations of great suffering, and they're making decisions to follow, they're just making their ordinary life decisions. And we see Boaz, who is just as a man of integrity, doing his day-to-day living, and God comes and faithfully, God comes and meets them. I was just reminded of a reading I was doing a couple of weeks ago, but I couldn't find it last night when I was trying to get. I would have tried to use their wording because it'll be better than what I can do now. But sometimes we did James last year, and it says, "Consider it pure joy, brothers, when you face trials of any kind." And I think sometimes when I think about that verse, I'm thinking about the really, really, really tough stuff. And I think I'm failing to see that sometimes day-to-day life can be tricky. Sometimes getting up and going to work can be tricky. And I think what this book does and what God is trying to say is he is there and he is moving in our everyday. And he is ahead of us and he's drawing us to himself. So, so I'm gonna close there. And why don't we stand and I'll just pray. Father God, thank you. Thank you for this story. Thank you that in the midst of a time where people didn't know you personally, you wanted to know them, but they didn't know you personally. And in the midst of that, you've given them the story of Ruth. You've shown them and you show us that you care about our day-to-day lives. You care about ordinary people going about ordinary things. You care about our suffering. You care about the big things and the small things, and that you're drawing us to be a people who follow after you. That you want to bring healing to our pain, restoration to our lives. That you want to reverse situations of suffering and give us your hope. That you want to bring joy. Thank you that, like in Ruth, we don't know the impact that we have in our day-to-day life on other people, but thank you that this book shows us that the actions that we have, that we do when we follow after you, can have long, long-reaching impacts on other people and on your story. And thank you that you are working all things together for good.